You can't stop my ex from coming to this house, Mike. I'm not your slave. Those words hung in the air like poison. My name is Mike, and I'm about to tell you the story of how one sentence destroyed my marriage and changed my life forever. I stood in the doorway of my own home, holding flowers and Ruth's favorite Chinese takeout, watching my wife look me straight in the eyes with a coldness I'd never seen before. Her ex-boyfriend, Donald, sat on our couch, the couch I'd worked overtime to buy, with his arms stretched casually along the back, near her shoulder. He wore a smirk that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This was a test. And I just failed it by caring. I'd left work 2 hours early that Thursday afternoon because I wanted to surprise Ruth. We'd been married for 3 years and lately I'd felt her pulling away. Cold responses. Late nights out with friends. Phones turned face down on tables. I thought maybe I wasn't doing enough. Maybe I needed to show her more attention, more love, more effort. So I bought flowers. I picked up her favorite orange chicken and fried rice. I practiced what I'd say in the car. I love you, Ruth. Let's reconnect tonight. But the moment I opened that front door and heard a man's deep laughter mixing with hers, something inside my chest cracked. I moved quietly through the hallway. Their voices grew louder. She was giggling, actually giggling, at something he'd said. When I stepped into the living room, Ruth barely looked surprised. Donald stood up slowly, extending his hand like we were meeting at a business conference. I'm Donald, he said. Ruth and I go way back. Way back. That phrase echoed in my skull. I looked at Ruth, searching her face for guilt, for shame, for anything that resembled remorse. Instead, she rolled her eyes like I was overreacting. He's my ex, Mike. Relax. We were just catching up. Just catching up. In my home. Behind my back. Without a word of warning. That's when I asked the question that led to those words. Catching up? You couldn't tell me he was coming over? And that's when Ruth stood up, crossed her arms, and said it. You can't stop my ex from coming to this house, Mike. I'm not your slave. Please, before I continue, kindly like, share and subscribe for more interesting videos. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't grab Donald by his collar and throw him out like every fiber in my body wanted to. Instead, I did something that confused them both. I went completely silent. I set the flowers down on the coffee table without looking at either of them. The plastic bag of takeout followed. Then I turned and walked upstairs to our bedroom. Behind me, I heard Ruth say something to Donald in a hushed tone, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't want to. My hands were shaking as I closed the bedroom door behind me. I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at the wedding photo on the nightstand. Ruth in her white dress, me in my rented tux, both of us smiling like we just won the lottery. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of working 60-hour weeks at the manufacturing plant so she could quit her job and find herself. 3 years of coming home exhausted and still asking about her day, still rubbing her feet while she scrolled through her phone, still telling her she was beautiful even when she barely looked at me anymore. My mother's voice echoed in my head, a memory from when I was 8 years old, standing in our tiny kitchen after my father had walked out on us for the third and final time. She'd been crying, but she stopped long enough to kneel down, hold my face in her hands, and tell me something I'd never forgotten. Michael, she'd said, using my full name the way she only did when something was serious, when you grow up and fall in love, you stay. You fight for the people you love. But if someone doesn't see your worth, if they treat you like you're nothing, you walk away with your head held high. You hear me? Dignity matters more than love. I was too young to understand it then. But sitting on that bed, hearing Ruth laugh with another man downstairs in my house, I finally understood what my mother meant. Some battles aren't worth fighting because you've already lost them before they began. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Ruth pushed the door open without knocking. Are you seriously going to act like this? She said, her voice dripping with irritation. I didn't answer. I just stared at that wedding photo. She huffed and walked back downstairs. 20 minutes later, I heard the front door close. Donald had left. But the damage was already done. That night, Ruth acted like nothing had happened. She came to bed around 11, scrolling through her phone, laughing softly at something on her screen. I lay on my side, facing away from her, staring at the wall. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't even acknowledge that anything was wrong. Around midnight, she fell asleep. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, completely unbothered. Meanwhile, I felt like I was drowning in my own bed. At 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep. I slipped out of bed quietly and went to the small office we barely used. I opened my laptop and stared at the screen for a long time before I started typing. The email to my boss was short. Dear Mr. Harrison, I am writing to inform you of my resignation, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. Best regards, Mike. My hand hovered over the send button for 5 full minutes. This was a good job. Steady pay. Benefits. Security. But staying meant watching Ruth disrespect me over and over until I had nothing left of myself. I hit send. Then I opened another window and started searching for one-way tickets out of the city. Anywhere. Everywhere. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it was far from here. I thought about my father, the man who chose his pride over his family and left us with nothing. I'd hated him my entire life for that. But now, sitting in that dark office, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I wasn't becoming my father by leaving. I was honoring my mother by refusing to let someone treat me like I was worthless. There was a moment just before dawn when I almost changed my mind. I walked back into the bedroom and looked at Ruth sleeping peacefully, her hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed. I remembered our first date at that Italian restaurant downtown. She'd laughed so hard at one of my jokes that she'd snorted, then got embarrassed, which made me love her even more. I remembered the night I proposed on the pier, how she'd cried and said yes before I could even finish the question. I remembered believing she was the one I'd grow old with. But then I remembered her words. I'm not your slave. As if loving her, providing for her, respecting her somehow made me a master trying to control her. I pulled my wedding ring off my finger. It felt heavier than it should have. I placed it carefully on her nightstand and grabbed a sticky note from the drawer. I wrote 3 words on that sticky note. I'm done, Ruth. Then I grabbed my old duffel bag from the closet, the one I'd used in college before I met her. I packed light, 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, my wallet, my phone charger, and a photo of my mother. That was it. Everything else in this house was just stuff. None of it mattered anymore. I took one last look at Ruth. Part of me hoped she'd wake up, that she'd see me packing and realize what she was about to lose. But she didn't stir. I walked downstairs and paused at the front door. The flowers I'd brought were still on the coffee table, wilting already. The takeout containers sat unopened beside them. I thought about leaving a longer note, explaining everything, but what was there to say? She'd made her choice when she defended Donald instead of her marriage. I'd made mine by deciding I deserved better. I closed the door quietly behind me and loaded my bag into my truck. The neighborhood was silent at 4 in the morning. Street lights flickered. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. A text from my best friend Steve. You up, man? Can't sleep. Steve always had terrible insomnia. I texted back, leaving town. Don't tell Ruth where I go. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, what happened? I didn't respond. I just started the engine and drove. I had no destination in mind. I just knew I needed to go north, away from this city, away from this life, away from the woman who just taught me that love without respect is just slow torture. As the sun started to rise behind me, I felt something unexpected, not sadness, not anger, but relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Ruth woke up around 11 that morning, stretching lazily. She reached across the bed and felt cold sheets. Mike, she called out, her voice still groggy. No answer. She figured I was already at work, probably still sulking about yesterday. Good, she thought. Maybe he'd finally learn not to overreact. She noticed something on the nightstand, my wedding ring sitting next to a yellow sticky note. She picked up the note and read it. I'm done, Ruth. She laughed. Actually laughed out loud. Is he serious? She said to the empty room. She grabbed her phone and called me. It went straight to a disconnected message. She frowned and tried again. Same thing. What the hell? She called my work number, the direct line to my desk. A woman answered. Hi, I'm looking for Mike. Mr. Mike resigned yesterday evening, ma'am. Is there something I can help you with? Ruth's stomach dropped. Resigned? That's impossible. He loves that job. I'm sorry, ma'am. That's all the information I can provide. Ruth hung up and ran to the closet. My side still had clothes hanging, but she noticed my duffel bag was gone. She yanked open the drawer where I kept important documents. Birth certificate, passport, social security card. Empty. She checked the bathroom. My toothbrush was gone. My deodorant. My razor. Panic started creeping up her spine. She ran downstairs and checked the garage. My truck was gone. She called Steve. Steve, where's Mike? His voice was cold, nothing like his usual friendly tone. He doesn't want to talk to you, Ruth. What? Is this a joke? Tell him to stop being dramatic and come home. Dramatic? You really don't get it, do you? Get what? We had a small argument. Small? Ruth, you disrespected him in his own house. With your ex. And then told him he couldn't do anything about it. Silence. Steve, just tell me where he is. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. Mike needs to heal. And you need to deal with the consequences. 2 weeks passed with no word from me. Ruth tried everything, calling my family members who hadn't spoken to me in years, checking social media only to find I'd deleted all my accounts, even driving by my workplace hoping to catch me. Nothing. I'd vanished completely. Then the bills started arriving. First the mortgage, $1,500 due. Ruth stared at it in confusion. I'd always handled the bills. She didn't even know the login information for our bank account. When she finally got into the account after calling the bank, her hands started shaking. I'd withdrawn exactly half of everything. My half. The savings we'd built? Split down the middle. The checking account? Same thing. She had $800 to her name. The car payment was $400. Insurance was $200. Utilities, internet, phone bill, it all added up. She'd never worked while we were married. I'd insisted she didn't have to, that I'd take care of everything. And I had. Every single month for 3 years I'd made sure every bill was paid, every necessity was covered, every comfort was provided. She'd never once had to worry about money. Now she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by envelopes, realizing she had no idea how to survive on her own. She tried calling me again. Still disconnected. She tried emailing me. Bounced back. It was like I'd erased myself from existence. In desperation she called Donald. He picked up on the 5th ring. Ruth? What's up? His voice was casual, disinterested. I need help, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. My husband left and I can't afford the house and I just... Whoa, slow down, Donald interrupted. Your husband left? That's rough. Can I stay with you? Just for a few weeks until I figure things out. Long pause. Then Donald laughed. Actually laughed. Ruth, I'm not looking for anything serious. I thought you knew that. But you came to my house, I came over as an old friend. That's it. Look, you're great and all, but I'm not ready for commitment or whatever this is. Ruth hung up without saying goodbye. She sat in that empty house, staring at the eviction notice that had arrived that morning, 30 days to pay or vacate. Donald never cared about her. He just wanted to prove he could still get her attention, that he still had power over her. And she'd fallen for it. She'd destroyed her marriage for a man who saw her as nothing more than an ego boost. The realization hit her like a truck. She thought back to 6 months ago when I'd said something at dinner. We'd been talking about a couple we knew who'd gotten divorced and I'd mentioned casually, almost too casually, I'll never beg someone to respect me, Ruth. If I'm not valued, I'll just disappear. She'd laughed it off then. Don't be so dramatic, Mike. Now those words haunted her. I hadn't been dramatic. I'd been giving her a warning. She'd just been too arrogant to listen. With nowhere else to go, Ruth called her parents. Her father answered. Dad, can I come stay with you for a while? Silence on the other end. Then, where's Mike? We separated. Her father sighed heavily. Come home, Ruth. She packed 2 suitcases and drove to her childhood home 3 hours away. When her father opened the door, he didn't hug her. He just looked at her with disappointment and stepped aside. Her mother was in the kitchen making tea. Hi, baby, she said softly, but there was sadness in her eyes. Ruth sat at the dining table, the same one she'd eaten at growing up. Her father sat across from her. What did you do? He asked. Not what happened, but what did you do? Ruth started crying. I had my ex over and Mike got upset and I told him he couldn't stop me and, her father held up his hand. You disrespected him. It wasn't a question. You disrespected a man who worked himself to exhaustion for you, who gave you everything you ever asked for, who loved you without conditions. And you threw it in his face. Ruth had never heard her father speak with such coldness. A man who provides, protects, and loves you without question is rare, Ruth. And you threw him away for pride. Ruth's mother sat down beside her and took her hand. Baby, I need to tell you something I've never told you before. Ruth looked up, tears streaming down her face. Her mother glanced at her father, who nodded slowly. 28 years ago I did the same thing you did. I disrespected your father early in our marriage. I thought because he was quiet and patient that I could get away with anything. One day he packed a bag and left. No warning. No argument. Just left. Ruth's eyes widened. She'd never known this. He was gone for 6 months. I nearly lost everything, the house, my dignity, myself. I begged him to come back. I wrote letters. I showed up at his sister's house where he was staying. I promised I'd changed. Her mother's voice cracked. He only came back because I proved it over those 6 months. I got a job. I paid the bills myself. I learned what it meant to struggle. And when he finally agreed to try again, I never disrespected him again. Not once in 28 years. She squeezed Ruth's hand. But Ruth, baby, not every man gives second chances. Some men, when they're done forever. The quiet ones especially. Ruth remembered something else I'd said once, something she'd dismissed as me being too sensitive. We'd been watching a movie where a wife cheated and the husband took her back. I'd shaken my head and said, I could never do that. If someone I loved disrespected me like that, I'd rather be alone. Her father stood up. You need to get a job, Ruth. Tomorrow. Start rebuilding your life. And if Mike never comes back, you learn from this and you never make this mistake again. That night, Ruth lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to her ceiling from when she was 12. She thought about me, where I was, if I was okay, if I hated her. She pulled out her phone and typed a text to my disconnected number anyway. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please come home. The message failed to send. She cried herself to sleep. While Ruth was falling apart, I was rebuilding. I'd driven 14 hours straight that first day, fueled by coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from pain. I ended up in Montana, a small town called Red Lodge that I'd never heard of until I saw the sign. The mountains were massive, covered in snow even in early fall. I rented a cabin on the outskirts of town, cheap, quiet, isolated. Perfect. I got a job within a week at a local construction company. The owner, a guy named Tom with a gray beard and hands like leather, didn't ask many questions. You run from the law or a woman? He'd asked during my interview. A woman, I'd admitted. He'd laughed and hired me on the spot. The work was hard, physical, exhausting in the best way. I'd wake up at 5, work until dark, come home to the cabin, make something simple for dinner, and sit on the porch with coffee, staring at the mountains. No arguments. No walking on eggshells. No wondering if my wife was texting her ex behind my back. Just silence and stars and the kind of peace I'd forgotten existed. One night, about a month after I'd left, Steve called. I'd given him my new number with strict instructions not to share it. How you doing, brother? He asked. Better, I said. And I meant it. Ruth's been calling me non-stop. She moved back in with her parents. Lost the house. I felt a small pang of something, not quite sympathy, not quite satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. That's her journey now, I said. Not mine. She wants to apologize. I don't want her apology, Steve. I want to move forward. There was a long pause. Then Steve said, You sound different. Stronger. I feel different, I admitted. I spent 3 years making myself smaller so she could feel bigger. I'm done with that. After we hung up, I sat on that porch for another hour. I thought about my mother, about how she'd survived my father leaving. She'd worked 3 jobs, raised me alone, and never once complained. On her deathbed when I was 23, she'd held my hand and smiled. You're going to be a good man, Michael. Just remember, never let anyone make you feel small. Ruth got a job at a diner called Maggie's, a greasy spoon off the highway where truckers and locals stopped for breakfast. The work was humbling, taking orders, serving coffee, cleaning tables, dealing with the occasional handsy customer. She made $9 an hour plus tips. On a good day, she'd walk out with $70. On a bad day, 30. She was exhausted constantly, her feet aching, her pride shattered. One afternoon, a businessman in an expensive suit left a $2 tip on a $40 bill. Ruth stared at those 2 crumpled singles and felt tears prick her eyes. She remembered how I used to tip, 30% minimum, sometimes more if the server seemed like they were having a rough day. Kindness costs nothing, I'd always said. She'd rolled her eyes at that back then, thinking I was just showing off. Now she understood. That $2 tip was a reminder that she'd lost someone who saw people, who cared about the small things, who led with generosity. 3 months into working at the diner, Ruth's phone buzzed during her break. A text from Steve. Just so you know, Mike's doing well. Got promoted at his new job. Bought a house. Ruth's hands shook. She wanted to ask where, wanted to beg Steve to tell me she was sorry, wanted to know if I ever thought about her. Instead, she just texted back, I'm glad he's happy. Because what else could she say? At night, she'd lie in her childhood bed and replay that moment over and over. Me standing in the doorway holding flowers, the look on my face when she'd said those words. She'd give anything to go back, to kick Donald out immediately, to choose me over her pride. But time doesn't work that way. Her coworker Linda, a woman in her 50s who'd been waitressing for 30 years, noticed Ruth crying in the back one day. Man troubles? Linda asked, lighting a cigarette. Ruth nodded. I messed up bad. Linda exhaled smoke. Let me guess. Good man. Treated you right. You took him for granted. Ruth looked up surprised. Linda laughed bitterly. Honey, I've seen it 100 times. Hell, I did it myself twice. Some women don't learn until it's too late. 2 years went by. Ruth was still at the diner, still living with her parents, still saving every penny she could. She'd learned to budget, to cook, to appreciate things she'd once taken for granted. She'd grown, but she'd grown alone. The regret never faded. It just became part of her, like a scar that ached when it rained. One day, a young couple came into the diner. Newlyweds, clearly, based on their matching rings and the way they couldn't stop touching each other. The husband pulled out the chair for his wife. He asked what she wanted and ordered for both of them. When the food came, he made sure she had enough before he started eating. Ruth watched them and felt her chest tighten. That used to be me and Mike, she thought. Her coworker Sarah asked her during a smoke break, "You ever think about dating again?" Ruth shook her head. I had my chance. I ruined it. You're still young, Ruth. You could meet someone. I don't want someone. I wanted him. And I threw him away because I thought I was too important to be a wife. Sarah didn't know what to say to that. Meanwhile, in Montana, I was living a completely different life. I'd been promoted twice at the construction company. I was now a site manager, overseeing projects, leading teams, making decisions. Tom, my boss, had become like a father figure. You've got a gift, Mike, he told me after a particularly successful project. You see what needs to be done and you do it. No drama. No excuses. I'd bought a small house on the edge of town with a view of the mountains. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Every morning, I'd drink coffee on the back deck and watch the sun rise over the peaks. I'd started going to a community center on weekends, helping build housing for low-income families. That's where I met Claire. She was volunteering too, painting walls with a focus that impressed me. We started talking during breaks. She was a nurse, recently moved to Montana from Colorado. She'd been through her own divorce. My ex wanted a trophy wife, she told me. I wanted a partner. We understood each other in a way that didn't need explanation. 3 years after I left, Ruth was closing the diner late one Thursday night. It was almost 10 and she was exhausted. As she locked the front door, she saw a couple walking down the street, hand in hand, laughing. The man looked familiar. Her heart stopped. It was me. I was with Claire and we looked happy, genuinely, peacefully happy. Claire said something and I threw my head back laughing, the kind of laugh Ruth hadn't heard from me in years. They walked closer, heading toward a restaurant across the street. Ruth stood frozen on the sidewalk, knowing she should walk away but unable to move. Then I glanced in her direction. Our eyes met. For a moment, time stopped. I saw Ruth, older, tired, wearing a diner uniform with a name tag. She saw me, healthier, stronger, at peace. There was no anger in my eyes. No hatred. Just acknowledgement. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe, hello, maybe, I'm sorry, maybe just my name. But before she could speak, Claire squeezed my hand and asked me something. I turned back to her, smiled, and kept walking. Just like that, I was gone again. Ruth stood on that empty sidewalk and felt the weight of everything she'd lost. Not just me. Not just our home or our life together. But the version of herself that could have been happy if she'd just chosen differently. She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and cried. Not the dramatic sobbing of someone looking for sympathy, but the quiet, hollow crying of someone who finally understood the cost of arrogance. She drove home to her parents' house, the same route she'd driven for 3 years, and realized this was her life now. Not because I was cruel. Not because I'd punished her. But because she'd pushed away the one person who loved her completely, and some mistakes don't get fixed with apologies. Meanwhile, Claire and I sat at dinner talking about our upcoming weekend trip to Yellowstone. She asked me, was that someone you knew back there? I thought about lying. But Claire deserved honesty. My ex-wife, I said simply. Claire squeezed my hand. You okay? I smiled. Yeah, I'm good. And I meant it. 2 years went by. Ruth was still at the diner, still living with her parents, still saving every penny she could. She'd learned to budget, to cook, to appreciate things she'd once taken for granted. She'd grown, but she'd grown alone. The regret never faded. It just became part of her, like a scar that ached when it rained. One day, a young couple came into the diner. Newlyweds, clearly, based on their matching rings and the way they couldn't stop touching each other. The husband pulled out the chair for his wife. He asked what she wanted and ordered for both of them. When the food came, he made sure she had enough before he started eating. Ruth watched them and felt her chest tighten. That used to be me and Mike, she thought. Her coworker Sarah asked her during a smoke break, "You ever think about dating again?" Ruth shook her head. "I had my chance. I ruined it." "You're still young, Ruth. You could meet someone." "I don't want someone. I wanted him. And I threw him away because I thought I was too important to be a wife." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. Meanwhile, in Montana, I was living a completely different life. I'd been promoted twice at the construction company. I was now a site manager, overseeing projects, leading teams, making decisions. Tom, my boss, had become like a father figure. "You've got a gift, Mike," he told me after a particularly successful project. "You see what needs to be done and you do it. No drama. No excuses." I'd bought a small house on the edge of town with a view of the mountains. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Every morning, I'd drink coffee on the back deck and watch the sun rise over the peaks. I'd started going to a community center on weekends, helping build housing for low-income families. That's where I met Claire. She was volunteering too, painting walls with a focus that impressed me. We started talking during breaks. She was a nurse, recently moved to Montana from Colorado. She'd been through her own divorce. "My ex wanted a trophy wife," she told me. "I wanted a partner." We understood each other in a way that didn't need explanation. 3 years after I left, Ruth was closing the diner late one Thursday night. It was almost 10 and she was exhausted. As she locked the front door, she saw a couple walking down the street, hand in hand, laughing. The man looked familiar. Her heart stopped. It was me. I was with Claire and we looked happy, genuinely, peacefully happy. Claire said something and I threw my head back laughing, the kind of laugh Ruth hadn't heard from me in years. They walked closer, heading toward a restaurant across the street. Ruth stood frozen on the sidewalk, knowing she should walk away but unable to move. Then I glanced in her direction. Our eyes met. For a moment, time stopped. I saw Ruth, older, tired, wearing a diner uniform with a name tag. She saw me, healthier, stronger, at peace. There was no anger in my eyes. No hatred. Just acknowledgement. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe, "Hello," maybe, "I'm sorry," maybe just my name. But before she could speak, Claire squeezed my hand and asked me something. I turned back to her, smiled, and kept walking. Just like that, I was gone again. Ruth stood on that empty sidewalk and felt the weight of everything she'd lost. Not just me. Not just our home or our life together. But the version of herself that could have been happy if she'd just chosen differently. She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and cried. Not the dramatic sobbing of someone looking for sympathy, but the quiet, hollow crying of someone who finally understood the cost of arrogance. She drove home to her parents' house, the same route she'd driven for 3 years, and realized this was her life now. Not because I was cruel. Not because I'd punished her. But because she'd pushed away the one person who loved her completely, and some mistakes don't get fixed with apologies. Meanwhile, Claire and I sat at dinner talking about our upcoming weekend trip to Yellowstone. She asked me, "Was that someone you knew back there?" I thought about lying. But Claire deserved honesty. "My ex-wife," I said simply. Claire squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I smiled. "Yeah. I'm good." And I meant it.